This is one-of-a-kind Orang Asli shared prosperity farm. Through setting up a collective farm enterprise with the Orang Asli, it's shaping a model of economic democracy. It's about putting people before profits and ensuring those left behind share fairly in the distribution of wealth and are equal partners in the supply chain. Through building fair markets and a bottom-up economy that establishes their true dignity, this enterprise has uplifted the Orang Asli from poverty. It's unified and strengthened community action and leadership. In this process, the Orang Asli are being mobilized to sustain their forests, restore their culture and dignity. This project is about building a pathway of hope and restoring their identity and create a given unique role to sustain the environment, combat climate change, and create wealth for the nation. In short, it's humanizing profit-making, putting people and planet in the center of businesses. In 2015, we started with 14 Orang Asli farmers. YKPM, or Yayasan Kajian Pembangunan Masyarakat, provided training and seed capital to set up this natural farm. YKPM also created fair markets by linking with partners like Giant Grocer. Today, in 2021, there are over 40 farmers, and this model is being replicated in a second village. Some of the Orang Asli are now earning 4 times their prior incomes and using their profits to buy washing machines, double up pocket money for their children, building housing extensions, buying motorbikes, and starting savings. A few have even used their savings to scale up their farms. The immediate target is now to grow their business management skills and engage Orang Asli farm partners, not employees, but partners and owners of the farms who will in turn develop a green economy and sustain the forest for the benefit of all. And finally, may I take this opportunity to thank OAMGF, UNDP, GF, Yayasan Hasana and Magic. Without their support, this project would not have been possible.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Malaysia World Indigenous Day Celebration 2021 webinar. On behalf of the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, we thank all of you here today in joining us to celebrate Malaysia's Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities. The International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples is celebrated globally on 9th of August with the theme Leaving No One Behind, Indigenous People and the Call for a New Social Contract. Today, UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam will focus on the theme Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities building back better. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. I am Fariza Alia and I will be your MC, guiding you through today's proceedings. We gather here to commemorate the Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities in their partnership with UNDP, civil society, and policymakers. On behalf of UNDP, once again, it is our privilege to have everyone here today, and we hope this webinar will offer you great insight on how Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities are building back better. Join us as we feature Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities collaborating with the Orang Asli and Orang Asal Micro-Grant Facility for Conservation and Livelihood, OAMGF, Global Environment Facility, GEF, and Small Grants Program, SGP Malaysia. Before we proceed any further, let me first walk you through the agenda. We have got a jam-packed conversation with our stellar lineup of speakers, moderators, and representatives from the Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities. Our webinar will start with some opening remarks by Mr. Niloy Banerjee, the resident representative of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. An officiating address will be delivered by Yang Berbahagia Dato' Ahmad Zamri bin Khairuddin, the Director of Regional Development Division from the Economic Planning Unit of the Prime Minister's Department, followed by a special address on the global context by Ms. Jameson Irvin, the Manager of Nature for Development Program from UNDP Headquarters. After a short break, we will be showcasing Orang Asli and Orang Asal knowledge products on traditional knowledge and indigenous folklore. Ms. Sumitra Sundram, the Project Manager of the Orang Asli Orang Asal Microgrant Facility, OAMGF, will be facilitating the showcase. The webinar will continue with 2 interactive sessions, where we will first hold a panel discussion with distinguished experts on the theme, How are Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities building back better? The session will be moderated by Ms. Manon Benier, the Deputy Resident Representative of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. In the second interactive session, there will be a showcase of success stories from selected grantees, which will be chaired by Mr. Asfazam Kazbani, the Assistant Resident Program of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. Lastly, the webinar will end with a closing remark delivered by Ms. Manon Benier, the Deputy Resident Representative of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. In between these sessions, there will be some poll questions shared, and we invite all attendees to participate in the polls for a more interactive session. You will also have the opportunity to submit questions to today's speakers by typing your questions in the Q&A chat option. You may send in your questions at any time during the webinar, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of each discussion with our panelists. Just be sure to start your questions with your name, your organization, followed by your questions. If, however, you are not linked to an organization, let us know whether you are a student or a retiree and just a little bit about yourself. Kindly keep to this format for the moderators to be able to unpack your burning questions. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's all welcome Mr. Niloy Banerjee, the resident representative of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam for some opening remarks on Malaysia World Indigenous Day Celebration 2021. Mr. Banerjee, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Fariza. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to be here. We are a few days off the official Indigenous Peoples Day, but this was the best day we could find to get all of you together. So, Salamat Pagi, Salam Sejahtera. Lovely, lovely good morning to you. To our distinguished speakers, Excellency Dato Ahmed Zamri bin Khairuddin, Director of the Regional Development Division of EPU at the Prime Minister's Department, Dr. Ismail Parlan, Director General Forest Research Institute of Malaysia, or FRIM, Excellency Muhammad Zamri bin Muzzatab, Deputy Director General Development of JACOA, Professor Dato Dr. Jenison Jayasuriya, All-Party Parliamentary Group Malaysia on Sustainable Development Goals, Dr. Wellin Jeffrey Jehon, Senior Lecturer, Department of Anthropology and Sociology at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Faisal Parish, Director of the Global Environment Center, Joshua Pandong, Coordinator, Wildlife Conservation Society Malaysia, Rufina Kayu, Program Coordinator, Pakos Trust, Tan Pei Chin, Researcher, Persatuan Science Hijau dan Technology, Jameson Irwin, and Manager of the Global Program on Nature for Development at UNDP, and my dear colleagues from the diplomatic community, the media, and from CSOs, and of course, my beloved UNDP colleagues, guests and participants. Welcome to Malaysia's celebration of the Indigenous Day, International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples.
Last minute the time.
In conjunction with the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, UNDP takes the opportunity to call upon colleagues in the government, academia, civil society, international partners, and the UN family to celebrate our Orang Asli, Orang Asal and Asli communities, their causes, their achievements, but also come together with them in their trial and tribulations. This year's theme of leaving no one behind, Indigenous people and the call for a new social contract, is in recognition of Indigenous communities' unique cultures, traditions, languages, and knowledge systems, and bringing equal rights and opportunities and respects and freedoms to our Indigenous colleagues and friends around the world. As you know, distinguished audience, there are 476 million, almost 500 million Indigenous people in 90 countries across the world. That's 6.2% of the global population, which is a substantial chunk of the population, which should find an equal place at the table with non-Indigenous communities. Yet, Indigenous communities are 3 times as likely to be living in extreme poverty. 86% of Indigenous people work in the informal sector, far higher than what non-Indigenous people work in. Indigenous women are even more disadvantaged. They experience multiple forms of discrimination, other than the usual lack of access to education, healthcare, access to ancestral lands, and of course, disproportionately high levels of poverty and violence. Now, and here comes the pandemic, and literally 2x's or 3x's all the challenges. While poverty, illness, discrimination, institutional instability, financial insecurity have all been, in some measure or the other, it's been incident upon all of us. On Indigenous communities, the impact is a bit higher, as you know. Let's bring the focus down to Malaysia. We have 4.3 million Indigenous people in this country. That's 13.8, almost 14% of the population. And of course, they predominantly live in rural areas. It's spread across both East Malaysia, in Borneo, and Sabah and Sarawak particularly, and of course, in West Malaysia, in Peninsular Malaysia. Now, being predominantly rural, the usual endemic challenges of accessibility, lack of physical infrastructure, such as road and internet connectivity, limited access to social services and economic opportunities, are all anyway incident upon our Indigenous communities. So what we try to do in UNDP, and it's really a small drop in the ocean compared to all that needs to be done. We work through active interventions with these communities, and we work really at two levels. One is the active implementation of projects and programs, but also try to influence policy in this direction. So, for example, after 10 years of working on this agenda of distributing equal access of benefits of biological resources to indigenous communities, we finally, one of our projects which piloted the concept, went on to become what is now called the Access to Biological Resources and Benefit Sharing Act of Malaysia of 2017, or as we call it for short, the Access and Benefit Sharing Act. This was done with the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, KETSA. And usually this is our modus operandi. The UN, as you know, works with CSOs, but also largely with host governments around the world. And here it's a wonderful partnership, both with our CSO colleagues, including academia, as well as with the government of Malaysia. Today, we are partnering with the Ministry of Finance, who have been generous with the support of this initiative, and of course the Department of Orang Asli Development, JOTWA, and government and civil society organizations through the micro grant program facility that the MC kindly introduced us to. This is a facility we've been running since 2019, and it primarily aims to support livelihoods, improve the economic ecosystem, of course, promote conservation and local knowledge and traditions. We are currently partnering with 8 NGOs, and really some of them are distributed networks of NGOs. So the number is actually much larger, but these are large 8 umbrella organizations who reach about 1,000 Orang Asli families, households across Malaysia. This is further complemented by a small grants program that we run in conjunction with the Global Environment Facility, which is, as you probably know, a global multilateral fund for the conservation of the environment and protection against climate change. Where our role, again, the work with the small grants program is really to demonstrate proof of concept on the ground, which can then be scaled up and offered as for policy adoption by the government. Last year, after the pandemic, we also made another breakthrough in digital connectivity for the Orang Asli, Orang Asal communities. We partnered with our fellow sister UN agency, the UN Capital Development Fund, or UNCDF, to reach several NGOs in Moyog, Sabah, to enhance digital literacy and also get micro producers connected to digital marketing and receiving payments through digital platforms. We use the commercial platform called Kundus, and I would urge you all to sometime visit our producers there and support their work. In Sarawak, we are working closely with our other partner, the Sarawak Biodiversity Center, with whom we have a long-standing partnership of many years, to support indigenous communities again in the production of local goods and strengthen online marketing skills. Ladies and gentlemen, for this International Day of the World's Indigenous People, this global dialogue on post-pandemic recovery, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and other challenges, is hitting us in the face, as you know. The recently released climate report on climate change by the UNFCCC sounds a stark warning about how important it is for us to get the people-nature harmony balance back. We are clearly off center, and we need to work closely. And I think our indigenous communities are at the heart of it. They set the standard of living harmoniously without a destructive dependence with nature. And Malaysia's commitment to the UN DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that the UN adopted in 2007, it's time to put fresh energy into that, to bring collective commitment, to bring concrete actions with innovation. We have to find breakthroughs. Clearly, the old tired script is not going to do it. We have to step up we have to step up our game, look at innovations, and see where we can find those little breakthroughs. Where I'm more optimistic is that the partnerships are becoming increasingly multi-sectoral. Private sector, academia, and of course the traditional partners, CSOs, have all started to join hands in this effort, along with the government, of course, and within the senior-most policymakers. I find a lot of sensitivity to issues of the Orang Asli. And so hence this day today, colleagues, to celebrate a little with you, but also to reflect on the road we have traveled so far and what lies ahead. And really also be a little sober about the challenges. We do have steep challenges. I just want to say that UNDP stands with you and we'll be happy to come together and put our shoulder to the wheel to make this common agenda that we all share really take effect and make real difference for indigenous people in Malaysia and around the world. With that, colleagues, I will wish you a very fruitful webinar and a lovely day. I hope you will take away a strong sense of commitment and renewed sense of commitment from this webinar. Good morning to you all again, and back to you, Fariza.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee, for that warm and broadly insightful welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor now to welcome Yang Berbahagia Datuk Ahmad Zamri bin Khairuddin, the Director of Regional Development Division from the Economic Planning Unit of the Prime Minister's Department, for him to deliver the officiating address.
Mr. Niloy Banerjee, President Representative, United Nations Development Programme to Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, distinguished speakers, guests and participants, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning. It is my honor to welcome everyone to the 2021 International Day of the World's Indigenous People celebration. Allow me to extend my appreciation to the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, of Malaysia for organizing this webinar forum. I'm also thankful for this opportunity to deliver the officiating address with the theme Orang Asli Asal Communities Building Back Better on behalf of Yang Berbahagia Datuk Saiful Anwar bin Lebay Hussein, Director General of the Economic Planning Unit. Yang Berbahagia Datuk Saiful conveys his congratulations and extends his apology for not being able to join this forum due to his prior commitment. 9th of August marks the International Day of the World's Indigenous People, when the inaugural session of the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations was held in 1982. It is an important occasion for us to recognize the collective contribution and resiliency of all indigenous peoples in our country, from Orang Asli in Peninsular Malaysia to Orang Asal, that includes Anak Negeri Sabah and Bumiputra Sarawak. The collaborative partnership between the government of Malaysia and UNDP can be traced since the late 1950s. It is the single largest multilateral organization providing technical assistance to Malaysia. Beginning 1972, UNDP's technical assistance to Malaysia is based on a multiple-year country program with the government. Since then, UNDP's work has been closely aligned with our 5-year national development plans, mainly to assist in providing policy inputs, research and capacity building, and support to specific thematic areas on implementation such as inclusive growth and sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, the government of Malaysia has implemented numerous initiatives to empower and elevate the livelihood of the indigenous community, including through various infrastructure development, poverty eradication and income-generating activities, as well as human capital development programs. Currently, the government is preparing a blueprint on national development policy for the indigenous people, focusing on 7 areas, namely economy, education, health, infrastructure, land, leadership, and culture, consistent with the 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, and also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We strongly believe in the rights of every human being to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and the theme of leaving no one behind. The right to health and healthcare is particularly crucial in the light of COVID-19 pandemic, particularly for poor and vulnerable groups like the Orang Asli and Orang Asal in Malaysia. It has been over a year since COVID-19 hit our shores and severely disrupted our economy. Last year, the economic growth contracted for 3 consecutive quarters, leading to a decline of 5.6% for the full year, the deepest contraction since the 1998 Asian financial crisis. This proved the extent of impact of COVID-19 on the economy, in fact, the most vulnerable in our country, severely. The impact of COVID-19 is still ongoing, albeit the current National Recovery Plan that is taking place. Various government stimulus packages such as Bantuan Sara Hidup, Bantuan Prihatin Rakyat, and Pemulih have been rolled out as part of a social safety net to help the B40s and most vulnerable groups in our country, including the Orang Asli and Asal communities. For Peninsular Malaysia, the Department of Orang Asli, or JAKOA, has supported the role of these packages to Orang Asli communities, while the state governments of Sabah and Sarawak have done so in their respective states. Ladies and gentlemen, in raising the standard of living and economic development of the Orang Asli communities, a total budget of 50 million ringgit Malaysia was allocated in budget 2018. This allocation has grown to 163 million ringgit Malaysia as announced in budget 2021. So we can see an approximate increase of about 320% in the span of 4 years. The focus of support to the Orang Asli community has also shifted over these periods. It has gone from being more focused on increasing the standard of living, economic development, and provision of housing, to ensuring equitable and sustainable economic growth, environmental conservation, as well as supporting civil society partners to work closely with the Orang Asli communities to ensure support is delivered to an efficient and targeted way. The government also places a priority in supporting Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities in Malaysia to ensure their well-being. During the 11 Malaysia Plan, 2016 to 2020, the government allocated 1.53 billion ringgit for development expenditure that includes basic infrastructures, namely roads, water supply, electricity, telecommunications, as well as housing and the Orang Asli Village Integrated Development Program in Sungai Siput Perak and also in Gua Musang, Kelantan. As for Sabah and Sarawak, the government had implemented program khas Anak Negeri Sabah and Bumi Putra Sarawak during the 11 Malaysia Plan to uplift the socio-economic and well-being of the communities. This initiative includes provision for basic infrastructures, skills and training, human capital, entrepreneurship, native customary courts, and land gazettement. Total allocation allotted was 389 million ringgit. In the upcoming 12th Malaysia Plan, focus will be on education, reducing poverty, as well as providing better infrastructure, basic amenities and facilities, healthcare services for the Orang Asli and the Anak Negeri Sabah, as well as Bumi Putra Sarawak communities. All these are expected to raise the community's ability to empower themselves economically and socially in leaving no one behind. Ladies and gentlemen, in this regard, I would also like to congratulate UNDP for undertaking projects aimed at raising the livelihood of Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities and improving environmental conservation. The latter includes the protection of biodiversity and integrated management of ecological landscapes to minimize the impact of climate change and increase the resiliency of Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities. Today, we have a special opportunity to participate in a discussion to know the progress made by the Orang Asli and Orang Asal in building back better despite the challenging times during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how well the government stimulus packages have served their needs. Additionally, this forum will provide an avenue for us to celebrate the success stories and the continued efforts by the Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities in preserving their traditional knowledge. My hope is that this forum will be part of a continuing dialogue that provides a platform for us to serve better the needs of the Orang Asli and Orang Asal and indigenous communities towards inclusivity and social justice. With that, I thank you. Wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Yang Berbahagia. Now, I would like to invite the Manager of Nature for Development Program, joining us live from New York, Ms. Jameson Irvin, to deliver her special address on the global context of the World Indigenous Celebration Day 2021. Over to you, Ms. Irvin.
Thank you so much, Fariza. Niloy, distinguished speakers, guests and participants, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to speak this morning about Orang Asli, Orang Asal communities building back better. I'd like to share with you 4 topics: the global significance of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, the importance of Indigenous peoples in helping the world achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the challenges they face, and the work that UNDP is doing internationally. Next. A few words about the history and significance of this event. In 1994, the UN General Assembly decided that the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples should be observed every 9th of August. The date marks the day of the first meeting in 1982 of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations. This global celebration originally began in 1995 after the UN General Assembly set it as an annual celebration for the International Decade of the World's Indigenous People from 1995 to 2004 with the theme Indigenous People, Partnership in Action. And one of the milestones of this past decade was the establishment in 2000 of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, the UN's central coordinating body for matters related to the concerns and rights of the world's indigenous peoples. Next slide. A few words of history about the United Nations UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This decade was extended to a second international decade of the world's indigenous peoples from 2005 to 2014 with the theme Partnerships for Action and Dignity. A major highlight of this decade was the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a global instrument that constitutes the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples around the world. Malaysia can be very proud that it was one of the 144 countries who voted in favor of this declaration in 2007. Next slide. The past decade saw major milestones when it comes to indigenous peoples. In 2011, the UN Indigenous Peoples Partnership was begun in response to UNDRIP, which called for the United Nations agencies to share resources and technical cooperation to fulfill the objectives. Their areas of work include legislative review and reform, democratic governance in indigenous peoples' institutions, access to justice, land and ancestral territories, and avoiding conflict with natural resources and extractive industries. Next slide. This year, 2 comprehensive studies were released on the status of indigenous lands, both supported by UNDP. that highlighted the importance of Indigenous peoples and local communities, or IPLC, the importance of their lands, and identified their challenges. And the studies pointed to some startling conclusions. They found that IPLC lands cover at least 43.5 million square kilometers. That's at least a third of the world's land. And this is significant for several reasons. Next slide. First, this matters for global biodiversity. Indigenous peoples have been proven to be better stewards over their lands than all other land uses. Their lands are largely intact. Indigenous peoples have been proven to be better stewards over their lands. So while 2 out of 5 hectares of land are degraded on this planet, and while we lose 12 million hectares of arable land every year, we lose 13 football fields of forest every minute of every day, Indigenous peoples have maintained their lands. More than 90% of IPLC-owned lands remain in good to moderate ecological condition, as you can see from this map. You can see the same phenomenon in Malaysia, comparing a map of ecological integrity and intactness with a map of the distribution of Indigenous peoples. There's a alignment. Next slide. Secondly, Indigenous-owned lands capture a large portion of the world's biodiversity. Over half the world's terrestrial biomes are covered by at least 30% of Indigenous territories. And many of these ecosystems have little to no protection outside of these Indigenous territories. Next slide. Moreover, Indigenous peoples' lands cover over a third of the total global area of what are called key biodiversity areas, areas especially important for species. Next slide. This holds true in Malaysia. Lands traditionally owned by Indigenous peoples contribute enormous conservation value by protecting these areas and ensuring the conservation of different types of threatened species and ecosystems. Next slide. This matters not only for Indigenous peoples and local communities, but it matters for all of humanity, and here's why. Nearly 1/4 of all Indigenous lands offer high or very high levels of ecosystem service provision at the global level based on a combination of 15 essential ecosystem services, including freshwater and carbon sequestration. Indigenous lands are critical for avoiding climate breakdown. Potential Indigenous and community conserved areas cover at least 1/3 of intact forest landscapes globally, areas with what experts call irrecoverable carbon, areas with vast stores of carbon that are potentially vulnerable to release from human activity. Next slide. And you can see in this map of carbon in Malaysia that Malaysia's soils and forests hold a vast store of carbon, and much of this carbon lies on areas traditionally owned and managed by Indigenous peoples. Indigenous stewardship of our biomass carbon is an important safeguard for climate change around the world. Next slide. The 2 recent IPLC land reports, along with the Indigenous World Report, point to a variety of threats facing Indigenous peoples around the world. Land grabs and large-scale legal and illegal mining continue even during a pandemic, and there is increased targeting of Indigenous land defenders. 331 land defenders were killed in 2020, nearly 70% of whom were working on Indigenous land rights. Next slide. We also know that Indigenous lands are under threat. 2 of the reports echoed these findings. We know that these pressures will continue in the future. More than 15% of all Indigenous lands are currently threatened by conversion, fragmentation, degradation from agriculture, oil, gas, mineral, logging. In the near term, over 1/4 of Indigenous lands are likely to face high pressure, and 40% are likely to face moderate levels of pressure. Next slide. The latest Indigenous World Report found something else. It found extraordinary stories of resilience of Indigenous peoples to COVID-19 around the world, including resilience in food security, social safety nets, and national regional dialogues. Next slide, please. UNDP has seen this firsthand. In Malaysia, for example, some indigenous communities had an abundance of produce supplies because they had no buyers due to the shutdowns, and yet other communities faced shortages. And with the help of UNDP's Small Grants Program, the communities were able to link with NGOs and civil society organizations and other indigenous organizations to purchase produce from community to community and evening out the supply. We saw this around the world in many indigenous communities where they have a system for social safety nets that is often lacking in other cultures. Next slide. UNDP has long been a champion of indigenous rights. In 1992, we created the Equator Initiative, an organization that celebrates the success stories of indigenous peoples and local communities. Every other year, we celebrate and shine a spotlight on local communities using nature-based solutions to achieve their own sustainable development goal. Next slide. Very excited to say that 3 of the winners, Equator Prize winners to date, have received the prestigious Equator Prize, Formadat, Umabawang Residents Association, and MESCAP. And those are all available on equatorinitiative.org. Next slide. These stories of community-led action on nature-based solutions underscore a truth that is often buried, that more than half of global GDP depends on nature, and that nature is the engine for at least half of the Sustainable Development Goals. Nature underpins our food security, it underpins our water security, and it underpins our livelihoods as well as our climate mitigation needs. Next slide. But our economic and development models have not caught up to this reality. 2 years ago, the Financial Times ran a 5-word front cover, "Capitalism, it's time for a reset." And last year, UNDP's Human Development Report created a planetary adjusted Human Development Index in acknowledgement that no country has yet achieved a high level of human development without having first had a significant and harmful footprint on the environment. Next slide. So we're seeing a new narrative emerge where we're talking about and with indigenous peoples, not as GDP of the poor, but as stewards of global GDP. Next slide. We see indigenous peoples as not only vulnerable to climate change, but leaders in climate resilience, knowledge, and practice. Next slide. We see indigenous communities not just as food insecure populations, but rather redefining food security through indigenous food systems. Next slide. And we're seeing an emergence of indigenous communities as redefining the models that underpin our economic systems. Next slide. In short, we view that Malaysia's indigenous peoples are leading the way in defining a new nature-positive economy, using medicinal and aromatic species and combining traditional knowledge with modern technology. Next slide. With cutting-edge laws and policies such as access and benefit sharing. Next slide. And in so doing, the indigenous peoples of Malaysia are showing us a path to the future, a development model that helps to achieve the SDGs while keeping nature intact. Next slide. This August marks the 26th anniversary of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, a time to celebrate the millions of indigenous peoples around the world and their contributions. But as we look to building back a better future, never has there been a better reason to celebrate indigenous peoples than today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Irvin, for that resounding message. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now be taking a short break for 5 minutes. One last thing before we go off for our break, may I kindly request for all speakers, panelists, and moderators to turn our cameras on for a quick group photo. Thank you. All right, everyone with their cameras on, Okay, look to the camera. 3, 2, 1, smile. Awesome, and let's have another one. 3, 2, 1, cheese. Okay, excellent, that's it. We will see you all back here again in 5 minutes for the rest of the webinar, which will begin with a showcase of Orang Asli and Orang Asal knowledge products on traditional knowledge and indigenous folklore. While you are on the break, we will be showcasing the Orang Asli and Orang Asal microgrant facility videos, and feel free to enjoy this lovely Tuesday morning with your coffees or teas while you watch the inspiring videos we have for you today. All right, see you at the showcase then.
The rainforests of Sarawak, Malaysian Borneo, are home to no less than 30 indigenous communities, with a rich traditional knowledge on how to use the immense variety of plants in their surroundings. The Sarawak Biodiversity Center has been documenting this traditional knowledge to help preserve it for future generations, make it available to a global audience. In 2007, during an expedition to collect traditional knowledge from the Borneo people of Kampung Semadun, village elder William Sa'u introduced the SBC team to Bungatag, hardy flower in Borneo, scientifically known as Adenosma nelsonioides. The active principle, carvacrol, is a well-known natural compound with antimicrobial, antioxidant, and anti-cancer properties. In collaboration with the Borneo, and in particular with the Borneo womenfolk, SBC launched a project to produce the essential oil of Bungatag reliably and sustainably and to develop a new source of revenue for the community. In early 2020, as a second indigenous community, the Iban of Rumah Simon joined the Bungatag project. The production chain starts with cultivating bunga taong to maximize yields. Next, the raw plant material is collected and prepared for extraction. The process of distillation takes place in distillation huts built to optimize the production of high-quality essential oil. Benefit sharing agreements ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of local genetic resources with the indigenous people. These agreements stipulate the right of the indigenous communities to manage their bunga taong resources and determine associated benefit sharing terms.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had a good break and have had a good Malaysian breakfast. Next, we have our showcase. As promised before the break, but before that, attendees, please spare a few seconds to answer our first poll question today, posted on the screen now. Our first polling question is, what percentage of the world's indigenous peoples live in Asia? We will open the poll for 30 seconds, so quickly guess, is it 66%, 55%, 26%, or 15%? Once you have chosen your wild guess, or perhaps some of you are pros, you can click submit. All right, we'll close the poll now. Thank you to everyone who participated. Let's pull up the results. All right, the correct answer is actually A, 66%. According to the International Labour Organization, 2/3 or 66% of the world's indigenous peoples are estimated to live in Asia. That is approximately 260 million people, and they represent 2,000 distinct civilizations and languages. Great, now let us turn our attention to the showcase of Orang Asli and Orang Asal knowledge products on traditional knowledge and indigenous folklore. It is my pleasure to invite Ms. Sumitra Sundram to the floor as the facilitator to this session. She is also the project manager for the Orang Asli and Orang Asal micro-grant facility for conservation and livelihood. Over to you, Sumi.
Thank you, Fariza. Welcome to the session which we're going to be showcasing Orang Asli knowledge products on traditional knowledge and indigenous folklore. We have two organizations that will be sharing their knowledge products with us. One is Wildlife Conservation Society Malaysia, WCS, and the other is Pakos Trust. So I'd like to welcome Joshua Pandong, who is a conservation biologist with the Wildlife Conservation Society Malaysia, based in Kuching. He's currently the team leader of the orangutan unit, and he's leading research in studying orangutan population in Sarawak. And we also have Rufina Koyu, who is a program coordinator at Pakos Trust. Rufina is a Kadazan from Penampang and is currently the program coordinator at Pakos Trust. She majored in early childhood education and joined Pakos Trust in 1994 as a community education program coordinator, and is responsible for the development of Pakos's community learning centers. So I hand the floor over to Joshua first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sumi, for the introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the WCS team, we wish to thank UNDP Malaysia for the privilege to showcase an indigenous folklore book entitled Wildlife Tales and Iban Myths from Sabah and Gunung Lesong in conjunction with the special occasion today. Why did we collect folk tales? Between 2018 to 2019, the WCS team interviewed more than 900 respondents from 72 villages. We found cultural association with nature was slowly fading. Under this OA-MGF, WCS aims to help communities preserve the oral history and traditional knowledge, especially those that show how nature contributes to their unique identity in a written, published format. We want to demonstrate to the Iban communities that their nature-based cultural identity is important and generate a stronger sense of stewardship over wildlife, orangutans, and intact forests. Next slide. How were folktales shared? We start audio recording once the storytellers agree to share their stories. The team managed to collate stories shared by more than 30 storytellers from 15 villages around Gunung Lesong and Sabah. We shortlisted 23 stories out of more than 55 stories as told in the Iban language. We then translated the stories into English and was reviewed by an external editor, Dr. Christina Yin, a senior lecturer from Swinburne University of Technology, Sarawak campus. We took selected stories from the book and developed into scripts for a 10-episode, 3-minute radio program produced and broadcast via Radio Television Malaysia, RTM's YFM. Next slide. Finally, how to contact WCS to get a copy of the book or if you have inquiries. The book is fully paid under OAMGF, thus, though not for sale, they are distributed at no charge. You may email to our admin at the email here, wcsmalaysia@wcs.org, or WhatsApp the number here. We are active on Facebook and Instagram if you wish to drop a line there. We encourage those who do request for the book to donate to a fund that will channel the royalty back to the storytellers. We will provide the details when you drop a message to us. Finally, we thank all the headmen and village representatives who contributed to the folklore book. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Sumi. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Joshua. Next, I'd like to welcome Rufina to share about her project.
Thank you, Sumi. Thank you, UNDP, for giving me the opportunity to share about our work. Hi, Kopivulsian. I want to share with you all what is traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge is the backbone of indigenous people. It is their identity, custom, social and spiritual, and is a way of life for indigenous people. They have knowledge that has been developed and practiced in the indigenous community. They are healers, astrologists, environmentalists, agriculturists, meteorologists, and educators. It has been practiced from generations to generations through songs, stories, music and dance, and also they have their own patterns. Usually the knowledge is taught in their own mother tongue. For this OAMGF project, PACOS has programmed to support the documentation process and promotion of indigenous knowledge to preserve and pass the knowledge from elders to the younger generation. Next. Why is it important for traditional knowledge to be documented? As we know, in the past, the elders passed down their traditional knowledge through verbally. But now we have advanced technology and many experts that allow documentation to be made in the form of videos as well as books. So these videos and books can become resources of reference and as learning material for future generations. It helps to restore and preserve the identity and native language as well as empowers the youths. Also to continuation of knowledge and practices in the maintenance and protection of natural resources in their village, contribute to the conservation of their land, territories, and resources. And lastly, we believe this traditional knowledge give opportunity to create community-based enterprise and sustain life through food security. So these are some of the products that we have made by the community. So this one is traditional food recipe. This one is traditional animal strap. This one is traditional wedding custom. This one is traditional medicine. And also we have poster, traditional moon circle. And also we have this CD traditional lullaby song. So this one is in Rungus language. So what is special of all this product? It's made written in their own mother tongue, in their own native language. So for more information, you can go to Pakos Trust website or Pakos Trust Facebook. Kotohadan, thank you, terima kasih. Over to you, Sumi.
Thank you, Rufina, and thank you, Joshua. So we welcome everyone to go and check out PACOS's and WCS's websites to get more information on their knowledge products and on Indigenous folk tales. You can find more information. We'll post the links onto the Q&A. So just a reminder to everyone, please ask questions in the Q&A channel of the Zoom app, and chat is not being used for questions. So it's just to the Q&A channel, and we'll share the links there. Thank you. Back to you, Farisa.
Thank you, Ms. Sui, and grantees for your sharing on Indigenous folklore and traditional knowledge. Indeed, folklores and traditional knowledge should continue to live on in our communities. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe by now we are ready to engage into a much deeper discussion on how Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities are building back better. But before that, again, we have another interesting poll for all attendees to participate in. The second poll on your screens here asks, roughly, what percentage of Malaysia's population are Orang Asli and Orang Asal indigenous communities? We have 30 seconds here before the poll closes, which is more than enough time for some of us fast typers to do a quick Google search of our communities here in Malaysia. Come on, colleagues, is it 15% or 13.8%? Could it be 10% or 5.6%? Click submit once you have locked in your answers. Interesting answers here, everyone. We've got some variation, but it looks like most of you answered 13.8%. All right, let's have a look at the results. Okay, and the correct answer is indeed B, 13.8%, according to the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, IWGIA. Roughly 4.3 million indigenous people, that is 13.8% of the country's population, live predominantly in the rural areas of Malaysia. Thank you once again for the active participation, attendees. Just a quick reminder to all colleagues, please post your questions in the Q&A chat option that will be addressed at the end of each panel discussion. Remember to include your name, organization, followed by your question. It is now my pleasure to invite our distinguished panelists for the awaited panel discussion. I will pass the session on to the moderator of the panel, President Representative of UNDP, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam.
Thank you very much, Farisa, and welcome everyone to this second panel and presentation of this webinar to celebrate this International Day. I would like to thank also Jamison Erwin for a very good global overview that really highlighted the interconnection between environmental, social, and economic development and the role that indigenous communities can and are already playing to support sustainable development. In this second session, we will do a deep dive and deepen our conversation into Malaysia context. We will reflect on the impact of COVID-19 on Orang Asli, Orang Asal communities and the support measures that have been put in place. We have three excellent panelists who will reflect on the lessons learned, the remaining gaps, and what is needed to truly build back better and move towards a more inclusive development, really translating the SDG principle of leaving no one behind into reality, which is at the heart of the SDGs. I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. First, I would like to welcome Mr. Mohamed Zamri bin Mustajab, who is the Deputy Director General of JACOA. I'm sure a number of you already know him very well. He has been working for 20 years with the Department of Orang Asli Development, JACOA, and he's really passionate about helping Orang Asli in Peninsular Malaysia and helping on their well-being and development. He has previously served in the Community Development Department for 3 years before rejoining JACOA as Deputy General Director. I think he will bring a very good perspective and experience looking into from the government on the challenges faced by the Orang Asli, Orang Asal community as a result of COVID-19, what support was put in place, and what are the challenges and the remaining gaps. So warm welcome, Mr. Zamri. Our second panelist, I would like to welcome Dr. Welleen Jeffrey Jehon. Dr. Jeffrey is currently a senior lecturer at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology Faculty of Arts and Social Science at the University of Malaya. She undertakes research focusing on community-driven development that includes the development of indigenous knowledge for community livelihood and women empowerment. So she will, and on a special note, she's also currently a member of the JEF Small Grant Program National Steering Committee, which you have heard about in the previous session. And she's also indigenous origin herself, Bidayu from Sarawak. So a warm welcome to you, Dr. Welleen. You will be bringing a very interesting perspective from the community level, really complementing our first speaker from the government. Last but not least, I would like to welcome Professor Datuk Denissen, who is the APPGM SDG head of Secretariat, member of the EPU Poverty Cycle, and co-chair of the Malaysian CSO SDG Alliance. I'm pretty sure a number of them have heard him as well, a number of forums on the SDGs. So he will be complementing and bringing very interesting interventions, building on perspective from government and communities to look into long-term perspective from an SDG framework and lens in what have we learned and how do we ensure that we leave no one behind if we want to ensure a more sustainable and inclusive development for the Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities. So each of our panelists will have 7 minutes to provide their opening remarks. So I will ask all of them to make their presentation. They were provided with 3 guiding questions for their remarks. The first one is, what are the challenges being faced by the Orang Asal, Orang Asli community as a result of COVID-19? What has been the impact of the stimulus package? And what are the gaps and what actions can we take to address them? So during their presentation, I would like to remind participants that if you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A channel in the Zoom. Please, if you can list your name, your organization, followed by your question. And after the 3 panelists' presentation, we will then open for interactive dialogue, which I'm sure will be very interesting. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first panelist, Mr. Zamri. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning. First of all, thank you to our moderator, Ms. Menon, the moderator for today's webinar. I appreciate the introduction. This year marks of the 36th year of the World Indigenous People Days. Since its announcement made by the United Nations in 1994, we are proud to be able to celebrate the World Indigenous People Day in Malaysia. And to our distinguished panels, Yang Berbahagia Datuk Dr. Denissen Jayasuriya and Dr. Welleen Jeffrey Jehon. It is great to be speaking with all of you today for the World Indigenous People Day celebration organized by UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. I also want to express my appreciation to UNDP for inviting JACOA to share our experiences in handling the COVID-19 pandemic for the Orang Asli. Not to forget, thank you to each and every one of you for being here today. Participants and partakers, ladies and gentlemen. Today, on behalf of Department of Orang Asli Department, Jakwa, I welcome you to this discussion and I hope we benefited much from this. Before we get started, I would like to touch on how the COVID-19 pandemic hit the Orang Asli community. In March 2020, the World Health Organization, WHO, declared that the outbreak of COVID-19 constituted a pandemic. As it was new to everyone in Malaysia, it was as much foreign to the Orang Asli. Jakwa, being the department that caters the welfare and advancement of Orang Asli communities, continuously put our most effort in acting those responsibility even more in this time of pandemic, because of course Orang Asli are affected in one or more ways, or might be even more vulnerable. At the early stage of handling this pandemic, Jakwa main challenge is on how to give the Orang Asli community the right information on what is COVID-19, as well as on how infectious and deadly it is. This kind of information has been delivered vastly through digital communication, meant to reach as many people in Malaysia as possible. But due to the fact that not all Orang Asli have the access to this information, the misconception of the virus and how to avoid mishap from the virus, the effort to make them informed and aware become very tough. Some Orang Asli communities even relate COVID-19 to myths and certain beliefs. So now let's see how Orang Asli community building back better during COVID-19. Okay, next slide please. The term building back better has been increasingly and widely used in the context of economic recovery from COVID-19. To build back better, recovery measure can be assessed across a number of key dimensions, amongst the health aspect, the livelihood of the indigenous people, and the needs of the education. Other can be social contract. What I mean in the social contract is in the context of the relationship and the role of the corporation, academia, NGO, CSO with the indigenous people, especially during and post the pandemic of COVID-19. What happened? The uncertainty of long and complex global pandemic of COVID-19 had put us struggling with medical access needs and the well-being of the Orang Asli and education. Social inequality have been exposed and rapidly made worse by the loss of employment and income by the Orang Asli. Although this is not the first economic crisis to expose this weakness, but the depth and breadth of the current circumstances have brought the issue of resilience and high preparedness in the government action. There are many Orang Asli who work in traditional occupation and subsistence economic or in formal sector are adversely affected by the pandemic. Jakwa records show that productive population aged between 25 to 50 are around more than 80,000 people. 12% is income earner, refer to an individual who through work derive income, which has fixed income. This means their income from occupational activities. The vast majority of indigenous people actually does not have fixed income, which is around 80%. This means those severely affected are the non-income earner. But at the same time, due to movement control order, MCO, the home income earner also affected. As lockdown continue, with no timeline in sight, Orang Asli communities face food insecurity. This is a result of the job loss and movement control order confront even serious challenges in access to food. Next slide, please. Government first priority in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic have been to overcome the health emergency and to implement rapid economic rescue measure. The food basket assistance is for the well-being of the citizen as a whole. Orang Asli people through Jakwa has been distributing the food basket in 5 phases. 3 phases in the year of 2020, and another 2 phases, and the 2 phases is in the year of 2021. In 2020, it involved 165,000, the head of the household, with a cost of more than 21 million. The government spent over 21 million, not only for the food basket, but is comprised of healthcare products such as face masks, hygiene set, and nutrition food in the year 2020. This year alone, we have distributed the food basket to over 125,000, the head of the household, with a cost more than 19 million. Via Penjana Kerjaya program, JAKWA has been collaborating with Perkeso in order to promote the creation of jobs among the Orang Asli and reduce the unemployment. Currently, there are 33 of Orang Asli involved in training and 40 getting a new job. As known by many, most of the Orang Asli live in the isolated or remote communities where healthcare services are difficult to reach and have limited capacity or do not exist properly. From our record, 308 Kampung Orang Asli are located in the rural area. This is around 36%. Kampung Orang Asli face challenges on the adequate healthcare access, mainly in Kelantan, Pahang, and also in Perak. COVID-19 has revealed a critical need for well-coordinated, multi-sectoral health emergency capacity and preparedness at all level and within our countries. Nevertheless, the government have regulation on this via Prevention and Control of Infectious Disease Act 1988, Act 342, which among of it is the public are required to follow strictly to the mandatory quarantine requirement and standard operating procedure during the pandemic. So I'm not going to elaborate it further. Our Orang Asli also are taking action and using traditional knowledge and practices such as voluntary isolation and sealing of their territories as preventive measure during the COVID-19. Next slide, please. Currently, the government priority is to obtain herd immunity, which means at least 70% of Malaysian population need to be vaccinated. Our government aim to ensure that at least 80% of Malaysian adult population receive vaccine by February 2022 to reduce infection, hospitalization, and death. Sorry, back the last slide. Okay. JAKWA has been worked closely with the COVID-19 Immunization Task Force, CITF, Ministry of Health, MOS at federal, state, and district level in promoting and assisting them reach Orang Asli for the vaccination program. Besides that, JAKWA also assists in the establishment of vaccination center, PVB, in Orang Asli Stop Center in Bawang Perak. The other 2 activities involved JAKWA personnel was to commute the Orang Asli from their village to nearest vaccination center and assisting the Ministry of Health mobile vaccination team to reach Orang Asli in rural area. Besides that, based on our experience, we strategize our action in handling the vaccination challenge. Number 1, increasing the registration of Orang Asli for COVID-19 vaccination voluntary by encouraging the Orang Asli leaders, for example, Batin or Headman, to get vaccinated as an example to their community, especially to those who hesitant either due to fear or misconception the vaccine is not safe. Number 2, giving vaccination priority to people with influence, activities, Orang Asli artists or Orang Asli social influencer to increase positive attitude toward vaccination. And the third one is having collaboration with Orang Asli NGO to build confidence among Orang Asli to get vaccination. Alhamdulillah, thanks to God, with these various approaches as I mentioned earlier, more Orang Asli are now aware of the importance of the vaccination, and we are getting more numbers of Orang Asli who agree to get vaccinated. If you refer to the slide, 3,225 Orang Asli has already received the first dose of the vaccine, and another 35,473 already completed the second vaccine as 32nd August 2021. To us, the Orang Asli to us, the Orang Asli are not anti-vaccination, but what we say and how we say it matters to the Orang Asli to help them to be vaccine confident among their community. Next slide, please. Since indigenous people normally live in a remote area, they have limited access to education. This situation in turn creates stereotype that link Orang Asli students with a lack of willingness to attend school. The mentioned characteristics are reflected in the school dropout and learning level of Orang Asli students, which is already a challenge to the agency. However, it even worse during pandemic COVID-19. To reduce the impact of school closure, the government introduced Digital Educational Learning Initiative. The home-based teaching and learning, PDPR, is the safest way to break the COVID-19 chain of infection during the movement control order. Although it is a promising initiative, these online services are only accessible to people with computer and internet service on hand. The initiative extended technological and social inequality in education accessibility to the Orang Asli student. Jakwa learned that another challenge with the home-based teaching and learning for the Orang Asli student. As mentioned earlier, the Orang Asli whom resided in the rural area, the main constraint will be internet access for the student. The Orang Asli parents do not have the devices for the home-based learning models, such as smartphone, laptop, or tablet. Not only that, the Orang Asli student and parents are not information technology literate. This leads to difficulty to the Orang Asli student, which they have to figure out how to use this digital platform on their own. Ensuring continuity, the access to education for the indigenous student is by providing necessary tools for remote learning and basic information technology knowledge. The government, via the Ministry of Education, has been urged to mobilize teachers to Orang Asli village, as their children do not have their facilities such as internet access and the device to join online classes. This effort is with a close cooperation between teachers and Jakwa. Next slide, please. The way forward for education is to provide the essential digital device for the Orang Asli student and make sure the efficient internet access in the rural area. Jakwa actually provide a transportation for the Orang Asli student from their village to the nearest school. Because the closure of the school, we are intending to provide them with the digital device for the online learning. Then we realized that the internet access must be there, otherwise it will be waste effort made. So as I mentioned earlier on mobilizing the teacher to the Orang Asli village. For example, teacher at the school of Kampung Orang Asli in Slim River Perak distribute learning material manually to the student on a weekly basis, and their progress will be monitored from time to time. Ladies and gentlemen, next slide, please. Finish. How Orang Asli facing the challenging time and getting back stronger to survive is a question that always needs to be answered, but still, the choice is in their hand. Nevertheless, Orang Asli are not alone and not being left behind, as the government, through Jakwa, will continue to serve and make sure their well-being being taken care of. I hope that the information shared will be inspire discussion leading to Orang Asli community building back better during COVID-19. Thank you to each and every one of you for being online with us today. Thank you. That's all. Over to you, Ms. Mellon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zamri, for a very comprehensive presentation, really highlighting some important challenges faced by the Orang Asli community, like the loss of employment, the very high percentage of community members that do not have necessarily a fixed income and are really relying, are in those, even in a worse situation with the pandemics, the challenges of health system and access in a context where you need to vaccinate in very rural areas and the health system and facilities are not necessarily there. You've highlighted as well the internet access and the challenges that it led for education of young people. Also a number of things put in place by the government to support and by JACOA like the food basket, the support to the vaccination program, the need to raise awareness on the importance of vaccinations and change perception around vaccination. So quite a number of challenges and initiatives that have been put in place. So thank you very much for this presentation. Now I would like to welcome our second speaker, Dr. Wei Lin, who will bring, based on her experience, the community perspective. Over to you, Dr. Wei Lin.
Thank you, Manon. Good morning, UNDP, fellow panelists and all, and also special greetings to Orang Asal on this celebration day. In my language, Selamat Sansan is just to mean good morning. So it is very crucial to hear the voices from the grassroots because the result of access and also the impact may vary. So I'm going to discuss and highlight a few points which are solely based on the information and also queries I gathered from colleagues and friends who are in the NGOs, researchers at University Malaya, and also medical doctors who have been working very closely with the Orang Asli communities, as well as Orang Asli individuals from the community whom I have been very fortunate being able to be in touch with them. So I just want us to remember of all the frontliners in our thoughts for the endless battle during this very challenging time. So it is very crucial to address the issues, the kind of challenges that are being faced by the Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities as a result of COVID-19. That actually brought us to think if we as in government have done enough to address, tackle and handle the situations. And we know that from Encik Zamri's presentation, there have been a lot has been done to help the Orang Asli on the ground, but sure, the whole nation and globally, we are facing similar situations, but situations for disadvantaged communities such as the Orang Asli and certain Orang Asal living in the interior are very worrying. So pandemic among Orang Asli is worrying due to many clusters among Orang Asli villages. So although they are practicing self-isolations and social distancing, but there are a few other challenges that cannot be avoided. So for example, among the more disturbing clusters are those in the Padang district, for example, in Tapah Bidor in the road to Cameron Highlands, and also like Pos Iskandar Tasik Perak, and also Rompin in Pahang and several villages in Negeri Sembilan. And new clusters have emerged in Kampung Petai in Johor, Raub in Pahang and in Sepang, and also in Kuala Langat in Selangor. So in all, at least 32 clusters have been formally identified, with some clusters having 7 to 20 villages in them. And the infection among the Orang Asli is also high compared to incidence rate. To the national rate and vaccination rate is still very low. So at least 60 Orang Asli villages have been placed under the enhanced movement control order, lockdown since the pandemic began. And a colleague of mine, Colin Nicholas from COAC, added that Orang Asli in villages adjacent to plantations ran a higher risk of contracting the virus from plantation workers, pointing out the vegetables farms in Cameron Highlands were responsible for the Postbrook and Terisu clusters. So in addition, COVID-19 positive Orang Asli who have returning to their villages for various reasons, including to attend funerals or to escape from quarantine, for example, have been the cause of a few clusters arising from close contact with their villages. I would just to give you certain percentage of the infection. So as of July 21st, 2021, only 12% of eligible Orang Asli have received first dose of COVID-19 vaccination, whether Pfizer or Sinovac. So the take-up rate has picked up off lately, but it is not expected to be more than 20% overall, as there is resistance to vaccinations among the community is still a bit high. So from the conversations with communities, mainly the distrust has something to do with their rights have been ignored, and talks mentioning that it could be government attention and conspiracy against them. So as we can see, this is the result when they cannot access the real information and also being influenced by the anti-vax who spread fake news to the communities which they cannot verify. And there was a huge effort, for example, to help to create awareness. And among the researchers from University Malaya, for example, they have been working together with Orang Asal groups to create posters about COVID, to create awareness in many Orang Asal languages, and have been used by Hospital Orang Asli Gombak, for example, to communicate with Orang Asli communities, and various collaborations with other organizations to tailor-made campaigns that's suitable for Orang Asli communities. Because we have to remember that Orang Asli, Orang Asal communities has a bit more special in terms of language and also cultural heritage. So most of the postures in many languages of Orang Asal is indication of social inclusion, where Orang Asli can see their languages used to convey the message and feel included. Therefore, response towards vaccinations has been more encouraging as reported. So these postures were sent through phone, but the question is really about the challenges to disseminate important information to those who live at the digital periphery. Yeah. So further to acknowledge from COC about the numbers who received their first dose, I think about 4,962 had by then received their second dose. That brings the total of Orang Asli who have had at least one dose of vaccination. About 15.7% of eligible Orang Asli. And now we look into the quarantine centers, for example. In certain cases, there is not enough supply. So there could be access to food supplies, but due to the logistic and also there are certain kind of challenges, supplies has not reached the quarantine centers. And especially, like, for example, in Sungkai Quarantine Center recently, there is no food supply for kids. So they were brought in late night and in hurry by their parents and had no time to prepare their stuff. However, the info has been relayed to Ministry of Health and also JAQUA with the hope that they have addressed it. And NGOs could only reach out as much as conveying urgent situations to the authority involved. And now the whole world is talking about third dose and also Delta variants and booster. That means Orang Asli will be very vulnerable if any one of them contracted Delta variant. So what preventive measures to protect them? Are we going to ramp up vaccination? But even the third dose is, we all know, may not be able to protect us against Delta. And so far, those who are fully vaccinated also still got infected by COVID. So now the fear is that if it reaches the more interior villages, the infectivity rate there would be much higher and it would be very difficult to treat, contain and support those communities. And this is true for all indigenous of Orang Asli and also Orang Asal in Sabah and Sarawak who are living in the interior. And my second point is on the general well-being, includes food and daily livelihood and socialization. So in general, the Orang Asli are being left behind in terms of development due to many factors, among others, the ongoing rights violations, especially on the land rights, and also violations of free, prior and informed consent, as much as we would like to ignore it, but this is the reality. So these rights are directly related to and determine their socioeconomic well-being. So we have read and heard about the news. NGOs and civil communities have assisted by giving food aid to the Orang Asli whose food access has been cut off. So certain Orang Asli villages that can still access the forest, they still manage to access resources. On coping mechanism, the Orang Asli are turning to going further into the forest as this is a fruit season time. So a lot of food in the forest. It would be unfortunate not to take advantage of the bounty provided by nature. Like for example, the Jahai who used to have contact with NGOs in Perak have moved into the forest. Having many facing challenges even to provide for their family, the forest is crucial to be accessed. However, very unfortunate for few other communities who lost their forest, take for example the Temia in Gua Musang in Kelantan. Before COVID pandemic lockdown, their access to food and good well-being has been disrupted due to their ongoing land grabbing issues and organizing blockades to fight for their land. And this unwell-being situation has for sure worsened by the pandemic. And with the amount of their forest being cut down, access to food and resources is rather difficult. So I'm just going to jump into to wrap up by giving examples on the indigenous knowledge and the role of indigenous knowledge in social distancing. There is one thing that I would like to highlight, that although we speak about social distancing and self-isolation, we have to be aware that Orang Asal communities are very close-knit communities living communally. So the closely knit nature of Orang Asli and Orang Asal in Sabah and Sarawak, which makes physical distancing within village confines almost impracticable, is another factor behind the quick spread of COVID. So it is very difficult for them to understand the meaning of real social distancing as they live communally and attend to the sick almost promptly as a community. And the wearing of masks within the longhouse is clearly a challenge because they are living within the same residential building. So these are the kind of reality that has not been taken into account when imposing SOP. Furthermore, living in the rural area, purchasing masks is not in the list of if they hardly access to everything else. So I will just leave it to the questions and answers in order to continue this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waylin, for providing a very complimentary intervention to Mr. Zamri when you highlighted the need to create awareness, but to localize the narrative and to localize the tools and the mechanism that we are using local language posters and to raise awareness on vaccinations and on the impact of COVID-19. And I think the importance of this local narrative is actually important beyond the COVID-19 as well. How do we use local language? You also talked about the general well-being and the mechanism that the communities have developed to cope themselves with the crisis and the impact that and the role that forest actually has in ensuring their livelihoods and well-being, and that the impact of forests is actually quite important and has reduced their capacity to generate an income during the pandemic. And your last point on social distancing as well, and that's also a cultural concept, and that is not necessarily understood the same way depending on the different cultural backgrounds. So thank you very much for bringing this very local and community perspective. I would like now to invite our last speaker, Dr. Denissen, over to you.
Thank you very much to UNDP for this invitation, and happy to be part of this panel. I think it's important that we have been reminded of the UN DRIP, which is the context of the right to development. And I'm also highlighting from the SDGs of leaving no one behind. And if we took the theme of this year's Indigenous Peoples Day, then it's a call for a new social contract. So the social contract in the Malaysian context, with the formation of a new government, with a new prime minister and cabinet, might set a new agenda for indigenous people and their rights. I'm speaking from the context of the APPGM, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sustainable Development Goals, which is a bipartisan action group, a research and action group. Among indigenous people, we have 18 community solution projects in 4 states, Pahang, Kelantan, Sabah, and Sarawak, and in 8 parliamentary constituencies of people from different political parties, undertaking income generation, capacity building for entrepreneurship, and also building community resilience. There's no time to go into details of these, but to take the 3 questions that was given to me and feedback from my colleagues on the challenges. I think it's already been highlighted. Education and digital divide is a key area, and this is something that needs to be looked at in a critical way, because already the dropout rates, the number of indigenous people, especially in rural and interior forest-based communities, is low, and their completion, and with the COVID, it's highlighted. But government might need to explore new avenues through solar panels, digitalizing, building the connectivity and the infrastructure to these communities in a more dynamic and a new way, rather than the traditional educational models. The second area that's been highlighted is the markets for their produce. While some communities were able to pass on, like in the case of the YKPM model, that they were able to get the logistics and connection to the supermarkets for the sale. Others, like in Sabah, were affected because the tamu or the marketplace was shut down, and this affected them because of their lack of digital ability and logistics. So this is an area that needs to be looked at. Sabah indigenous people still continue to raise the issue of refugees and migrants as a major group that impacts them in many ways, and this needs to be addressed. In terms of the impact and the provisions, while vaccination was highlighted and the challenges, food rations and aid, but in many ways, it's not the short-term quick food distribution, but the long-term issues on sustainable development that are more critical and needs to be addressed, and their acute deprivations was further highlighted because of the pandemic in this context. And this leads me on to 3 points on the gaps. One is Malaysia still continues to use poverty line income, which is a measurement of the basket of goods between food items and non-food items. And while this has been revised to a higher level of over 200, but still the delivery agencies are still using the old PLI, but the multidimensional poverty that was introduced in the 11th Malaysia Plan is a better indicator and could be like a scorecard to measure at real level of delivery, because it addresses education, health, living conditions, and income, which is livelihood support and sustainability. 4 dimensions and 11 indicators to then be applied by not only JACWA, but the indigenous communities and work in rural Sabah and Sarawak, especially the interior area. And this needs to be refined in a way that data is collected and utilized. Second, which I didn't hear much discussion here, is actually land rights. Much of the contestation of indigenous people is their land rights. I think this was highlighted in the global overview of the forest coverage and how indigenous people are part of the forest, which gives possibilities to community forestry, to green economy. And indigenous people are not seen as experts in this area, and therefore the shift of them as being subjects or objects of poverty eradication to people with ground knowledge of conservation, water sources, and so forth, as highlighted earlier. So community forestry should be an area in which people living in the forest and near the forest, rather than a protective, and the challenges vis-a-vis private takeover for plantation, for dam development, for golf course and other areas should be reduced in a way. My final point, and I'll close with this, that the new social contract requires genuine partnerships. What we have now is briefing or calling a leader out in an isolated way to a government department to brief them, but really community participatory consultation and decision making, that people on the ground know best on what is the kind of development that they want, what is the kind that would build resilience and sustainability, and rather seeing them as ignorant, poor, powerless communities. So partnership, as in SDG 17, is critical, and the government agencies as well as development planning that is very much top-down need now to empower. I think the UNDP funding of micro projects as well as the APPG model is revealing alternative empowerment of the community to sustain it in the way that they want. And I think that is the new social contract. If people can be treated with dignity, with respect, that the bureaucrats, the politicians, don't abuse that relationship, the power relationship, and translate that with rights, respect, duty of state party in that way. So really honoring UN DRIP And I think it was told that Malaysia is a signatory of it, and now Malaysia seeking a place in the United Nations Human Rights Council then needs to display far more its protection on natives, on indigenous people, on their land rights, and respond effectively to the Human Rights Commission report on land rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dennison, for a very complimentary presentation as well, where you brought us really at very important issues as well that can help us further support the Orang Asli community. You referred to the NPL, the need to look at poverty from a multi-poverty line index, and how this can help, looking at it from a multi-dimension, can help us generate data that can be used to really provide further access to the remote communities and some that are not necessarily included now in the measurement and the data. You've also talked about the land issue and the community forest model which need further thinking and further discussions. And last point, you also highlighted the importance of developing genuine partnerships and multi-stakeholder partnership and new ways of partnering with indigenous communities and build the new social contract. So thank you very much for those three very interesting perspectives from the three panelists. There's quite a number of questions. I'm mindful of time. I think we've run a little bit over, but I decided to let all the panelists speak because you were all bringing actually very relevant points. So I know most of the questions are being answered by colleagues in the chat box. And since we are short of time, I will ask three questions in one, and then ask each of our panelists to come in and respond to either one or to just provide a closing reflection. So I've looked at the checkbox and tried to summarize some of the questions. So one of them is related to building back better, and given the challenges seen in education during the pandemic, what is JACOA's plan to improve access, given the lack of internet access despite distributions of devices? Are there plans to improve internet infrastructure? How are initiatives to send teachers directly to villages being implemented? And finally, has JACOA seen higher school dropout since the beginning of the pandemic? So this is one of the questions. Another one is related to what can we learn from traditional knowledge and indigenous communities about sustainable development and greening Malaysia? And the third one is, what innovative partnership would the panelists like to see more to support Orang Asli Asal communities in building back better? So as we are answering your question in the chat box, I would like to invite our panelists to just provide some reflections on those trends and questions that were coming in the chat box. So I would like to, anyone would like to go first?
Okay, can I quickly make intervention and 2 points? One is building back better through education. I agree on the digital divide, connectivity and resources, but I think we need to rethink the model of schooling as well. And there are many creative approaches that the homeschooling movement and others, as opposed to hostile model of education, 7:30 in the morning to 1 o'clock, the curriculum and so forth. So while the digitalization and the curriculum and the mode of teaching and using social enterprises or other groups to actually enter rather than traditional the education to farm it out and so forth. That's my point on that. And on innovative partnerships, I think it's really an attitudinal approach, not patriarchal, not I know better than you, but to create the mechanisms for a consultative process on the ground which is very different from representative partnership to participatory partnership, where the whole village needs to sit down and go through the process. And I think that's very different from the kind of parliament that we have and so forth. And so we need a rethink in the new social contract. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dennison. I was just informed that unfortunately, Mr. Zamri is having internet connection issues, so I hope he will be back with us soon, but I would like to invite Dr. Wailing now to provide some reflections on those questions.
Yes, happily. I would like to address the indigenous knowledge for sustaining and greening of Malaysia. I think NGOs and also governments, and especially UNDP and under SGP grant, for example, we have a lot of projects that does documentations and work at the ground. And I think it is prime time for our Ministry of Education, for example, to give platform to the indigenous groups and also educators to bring in the expertise and knowledge to our formal education, because this is what really missing. You know, like in the school, at the university, for example, we do not have any access to discuss and to learn further about our indigenous and traditional knowledge. Like for example, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada, even in the United States, for example, they have certain kind of platform to bring in indigenous knowledge to be taught to the younger generations, whether they're indigenous or not indigenous, because these are the crucial core values knowledge that is very important for survival and also for the continuity of the for the indigenous people to really practice, because after all, we acknowledge them as the guardian of the forest, as the guardians of the nature. So why only talks and not implementing it, you know? And then also my second point on the same topic would be all of the documentations that we have now should be included in a special database that can be accessed by researchers, by students, you know, instead of reading about indigenous knowledge from other countries. Why not expose this to our students, to our researchers? And it was a very good effort by the WC, by Joshua Padong, when he was making this well known to public. But we need to level up this effort, because I think schools and institutions of learning is the good platform to use indigenous knowledge for implementation of community projects, and also to bring back this knowledge to the community, because a lot of time the knowledge that we gathered from community, it's stored, published, and researchers got the names and everything, but it has never really been contributed back to the community for the use of the communities. That's my 2 cent point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wellin. I think I was just informed we have a few more minutes. I was allowed to extend a little bit because there's a lot of questions, and it's actually a very interesting conversation. So there's one more question here. What has been done to promote agroecology among Orang Asli communities? This is from Claire Westwood, Creation Justice Commission. I don't know, maybe if one of you can answer that question.
Doc, do you want to, you might have Dr. Jeffrey?
I think you go first, because
okay.
I have
I think my context, of course, is much more on community forestry, but noting the work of indigenous people on agro-based areas like organic farming, fishery, and other forms is actually a way forward. Because of the access to land, it's linked to food security. It's now more the output, so that they don't use, because very often bureaucrats are more interested in plantation type of work as opposed to smallholder development. I think in indigenous communities, and there are other models in which the smallholder cooperative models with building community resilience and empowerment, with adequate knowledge on marketing, logistic support, would actually enable them. And these are areas in which the state then needs to have an hand-holding process. So whether it's the Orang Asli community that's moved on, or in Sabah, Sarawak, we are seeing large numbers in which they can. But our country is prone towards plantation type of economy and displaces traditional agriculture and so forth. This is even taking place in Johor, in other states as well, where agriculture is downplayed and so forth. In contrast to countries like Japan, Korea, even China, where agriculture and young people, modern farming methods are used. I hope that's to the point. Thank you. Doc, over to you.
Okay, I will just include briefly. Okay, when we speak about agriculture, one of the challenges that I've seen at the ground is that there are a lot of our indigenous farmers basically have a kind of self-subsistent agriculture that actually for their own consumptions, and also a lot of them basically bring out their products to the farmers market or wet market, and is very situated in different districts. And one of the challenges that I can see, if it would be to be addressed, like the whole indigenous communities can basically provide organic products to the supermarkets and also to any major outlets in the countries, if they would have the platform and access to do this kind of business and networking. Our problem among indigenous communities is that we do not have access to real and proper network and communications and platform in order to progress us further. We have all the expertise, and some of them have lands. And I got to know that there is a friend of ours in Long Pasir in Sabah, for example. He has been planting avocados, a very good quality avocados, but he just do not know how to market it anyway, because he's somewhere in the highland, and it is impossible in terms of logistic, in terms of knowledge on packaging and all these kind of things. So if only government through Department of Agriculture help at least to provide this platform, this kind of knowledges, our indigenous people, I can tell you, they will truly thrive in the aspect of agriculture versus plantation. Okay, because I must say strongly here that plantation does not really give any much benefit to our indigenous communities, because it is not our way of life. I mean, of course, there are some of these under joint venture that has actually reaped off some benefits, but to the majority of indigenous people, our way of traditional organic farming is still the preferences. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Willing. I'm looking if we still have Dr. Dennison on the line as well, or if he also got connection problem. Dr. Dennison, are you there? Needed to leave. Okay. So we had to unfortunately leave our discussion because we were a little bit running over time. So I think we will have to, I'm just looking now if Mr. Zemri will be able to join us again. I don't know if I can get a quick update just for the closing remarks of this panel. Okay. So this will be, I think we will be concluding, unfortunately, this discussion, but maybe I will leave it with you, Dr. Willing. There was one question which I think could be a good ending, which was related. I'm looking, there are so many questions. It just shows we need to do another of those sessions so we can deepen the conversation. But one that is linked to partnership. No, there are many NGOs doing good work on the Orang Asli communities instead of working in silos. How can we pull out our resources together to provide more centralized leadership in the works towards the Orang Asli community? Rotary Club in Peninsula has been assisting Orang Asli community for years. We need more support direction from centralized leadership, no? And maybe bringing, that could be your last. There is also one on land rights, which I think you might want to cover quickly. How can the government support in this area should move forward with regards to recognition as customary land owners, no? So maybe I let you reflect on those two, Willing, before we close our panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam. These two are very, very big issues, and I don't think I can give the real answers here, but we have organizations like UNDP and also SGP that actually give out funds and grants to all these NGOs projects. We're sitting as a committee member at the NSC of SGP, for example. There are a lot of projects that addressing the issues and also partnerships of NGOs with community projects. And I think if we actually start from there, you know, and just to map out on how to create this kind of leadership, that will be very interesting. And then on the land right issues, this is an ongoing issue, you know, so I mean, there have been a lot of people, and there are still a lot of people like lawyers and also NGOs out there who are helping the Orang Asli communities, for example, to address the issues of the land rights. And this is ongoing battle. And even in Sabah and Sarawak, we still have the same problems. And mostly, I think I would have to say this, that the development of the native land and also Orang Asli land, for example, it has not been very structured, and most of this development of this land actually mostly benefit the state or the country, but it's not so much people-centered. This is what I have to say. I mean, you can see some examples where some land been developed, some land has been developed, but the Orang Asal and Orang Asli who used to live in this land has been displaced. So I leave that to a question mark to all of you to digest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Welling, to continue provoking the reflections among all of us, no? And for very good, I think, yeah, the came out very strongly in all a number of questions as well in the chat box on how we further build that stronger partnerships and multi-sectorial interventions to help, including involving the communities themselves, no, in defining the problems, in identifying solutions, and move towards a more sustainable future. So I think I will have to close, unfortunately, our panel here. I feel myself, I would like to stay on and continue the conversation because this is really rich. I would like to thank our panelists, Mr. Kemry, who unfortunately had to leave us a little bit before due to connection issues, and also Dr. Denissen, Dr. Wayling for sharing your experience, your perspective, and help Malaysia shape, improve and always shape new policy support for Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities. So thank you, everyone. And now I will hand it over back to Farisa. Over to you.
Thank you, honorable panelists, for the insightful and interesting discussion. Attendees, I see excellent questions coming in here in the Q&A box, and I'm loving the energy so far. Let's keep it up for the rest of our proceedings today. As a gentle reminder, your questions will be addressed at the end of the panel discussion. You can submit your questions through the Q&A chat, but please don't forget to begin the questions with your name and organization. If you are not linked to an organization, then please say if you are a student or a retiree. Without further ado, let us move on to the next part of our agenda, the showcasing session. UNDP will be featuring success stories of community livelihood and environmental conservation by selected grantees. The showcase will be followed by a plenary discussion moderated by Mr. Asfazam Kasbani, Assistant Resident Representative Program, UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. You must be familiar by now, attendees. That is right. It is time for our last poll for today, which you can see on your screens. Which two states in Peninsular Malaysia have the largest Orang Asli populations residing in them? To make this last poll interesting, let's take a virtual trip together, everyone, and imagine, is it Sabah and Sarawak, our negeri di bawah Bayu and Bumi Kenyalang? Or is it in Pahang, where our highlands are, and Perak, where the beautiful Pulau Bangkur is? If you think it's right here, or at least where I am, in Selangor and in Pahang? Lastly, Perak and Perlis with the charming green rice fields, or sawah padi. As with before, attendees, please choose the answers you are most confident with and click submit. We'll be closing the poll soon, so put that geography studies from your school days to use. All right, let's see if you guys got it right. Here are the results. And most of you answered Pahang and Perak. The winning answer is indeed B, Pahang and Perak. According to the Department of Orang Asli Development JAKOA, data quoted in a 2017 article in the International Journal of Humanities and Social Science Invention, around 70% of Orang Asli live in Pahang and Perak. Does this surprise you? Just like during your school days, it was a trick question here, attendees. The question was in the context of Peninsular Malaysia and not whole of Malaysia. So Pahang and Perak are not the two states with the largest Orang Asli populations in Malaysia, but rather only in Peninsular Malaysia. Hope we had a little fun there, attendees, in our last poll. All right, it's time to pass the virtual floor over to Mr. Asfa for the speakers to share success stories of the Orang Asli and Orang Asal grantees. Mr. Asfa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Fariza. I would like now to move into the last session. So this will be a showcasing session. So the theme for this session is on success story that Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities that they have been experiencing for building back better. First of all, I would like to thank so much for your attendance to this event. Thank you, Manon, and also the previous speakers in the previous session. As you can see, the movement of our discussion in today's event, going from the global perspective, where Jamison has shared you what has been going on in the indigenous people globally, as well as linking this with UNDP. Then we move into the policy discussion that Manon and the team has discussed. And now we are discussing about stories on the ground. I would like to introduce 4 speakers to you. First is Anne Lasimbang, Executive Director of PACOS Trust. Number 2 is Faisal Parish, the Director of Global Environment Center in Peninsular Malaysia. Next is Ms. Tan Pechint from Persatuan Sains Hijau and Technology on a Warming Up project. And last but not least, yang berbahagia, Dr. Ismail Parlan, the Director General of Forest Research Institute of Malaysia. As you can see, the composition of speakers today in this session, ranging from representative from Sabah, Sarawak youth and the communities as well, works in Peninsular Malaysia by the Orang Asli themselves, undertaken by GEC, and last but not least, to conclude our discussion, will be from the government agency themselves, who has been looking into issues on access and benefit sharing, how it will then be benefiting the Orang Asli communities. Right. Without further ado, I would like to invite Anne Lasimbang, the Executive Director of PACOS, for her presentation. Speakers, you are given 5 minutes for your presentation. Over to you, Anne. Hi, Anne, we can't hear you.
Okay. Am I okay?
Yes, yes.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you, Asfal. Thank you to the organizers for having me in this panel. I think it is very auspicious for us because I think this is the first time that UNDP is organizing this International Day of the World Indigenous Peoples 2021. Yeah. So we were, as panel, we were given 3 questions besides being given 5 minutes. The first question is, how are Orang Asli or Orang Asal communities building back better from the COVID-19? As from the previous panels, we know that the Orang Asal communities have been very much impacted. We have seen and heard that, you know, we have faced a lot of issues, a lot of problems, and a lot of Sabahans stranded in Kuala Lumpur because they couldn't go back. They have not enough money. They have lost their jobs, and a lot of those indigenous community who were in town who had job also lost their job, and those who are selling in the market, the tamu is closed. But despite that, are we building back better? Are we adjusting ourselves to the COVID-19? For the first time, last 2 weeks, because this COVID-19 has actually reached to even the remote part of Sabah, and we have found that all the districts in Sabah are in red zone. That means there is no more district that are remote and cannot be you cannot escape from this COVID. So we have thought we better do something about it. So a lot of the communities who have land and who are more organized, who have actually for a long time, from our observation, who has received grants from SGP are doing better. Their land are intact, and they are actually going back to the traditional herbal medicine, how it can help them, what kind of natural food can they have to strengthen the immunity, and also what are their traditional lifestyles during lockdown. Like, it is our tradition that if it is a lockdown, we must not make a lot of noise, we must not have any merrymaking. So when it is under the pandemic and under the lockdown, it is something not unusual for indigenous communities. And also many have gone back to their respective villages and actually have gone back to basics, and they are living in the traditional way of reciprocity and safeguarding the food security of their community members. And that's very important because there is now a very strong awareness of the importance of their land and their territory. And also, from what we have seen from the OAMGF virtual monitoring visits, the community are also embracing technology to communicate with the outside world. So many communities are learning how to use Zoom, how to use to learn from Zoom. Besides, of course, the school children, they are already part of it. And of course, there are challenges, the internet connection, but I will speak about that later. And question number 2 is, what indigenous practices have been found to be successful and how can they be replicated? Indigenous people's response and coping mechanism to this actually is to ensure that we survive. So that's why it's very much grounded on traditional knowledge, customs, and practices. So these are knowledge that has been passed down over generations because indigenous community has faced a pandemic before. So these are knowledge that now we are trying to remember and trying to see whether we can still practice it, so that the community as a whole can survive over this pandemic. And what can be replicated? They can stay, when they stay within their own compound, they plant food for themselves. So I think every family has a garden, and I think this one can be replicated whether you're in town or wherever. The use of herbs and also to getting to know the community and nature. Next, please. And the last question is, what support is needed to help build better? So I think I have a few suggestions as an indigenous community myself. First one is acknowledging and giving the Orang Asal community respect and dignity in Malaysian society, because this is very important. We need is understanding our worldview, our values, our lifestyle, why nature like the forest, the river, the peat, the mangrove are very important to us. And we can be invited as co-managers of important areas. And special funding like the OAMGF or SGP is very good, and I think it's a complete concrete action. Number two is to support to get indigenous people's rights to their land and resources respected and recognized. They would be better able to fend themselves in times of crisis and would not have to look for outside help. If traditional resource use and management practices are respected, strengthened, there would be less destruction of nature and perhaps less possibility for to develop. These are among the greatest lessons from this global health pandemic, and it is our hope as indigenous community that the policymakers will do what is needed to ensure that these rights are not forgotten. And number three, we need support in capacity building, in skills that are relevant to both men and women. From the OAMGF projects, I can see that we need to learn about public speaking, project management, financial management, leadership, and effective communication, and so on. And finally, support for better telecommunication services for rural communities so that learning and marketing our produce can be done effectively. So these are some of the support that we need. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, and back to you, Asal.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, and if I can sum up your quick presentation just now, I'm quite glad to see that the OA communities who have been building capacities with SGP as well as OAMGF has slightly more resilient when it comes into crisis as this. That's a good thing to know. And point number two is about going back to the basic understanding about, as simple as managing projects, public speaking, leadership, and as well as learning new stuff like digital technology and all that. Thank you so much for your intervention. And I would like now, therefore, invite Faisal to come in and also and present his work. Faisal, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I'll be showcasing some success stories of Orang Asli livelihood and environment conservation. And many of these activities have been supported through the Orang Asli, Orang Asal micro grant facility for conservation and livelihood, and also by other agencies such as Yayasan Hazana, Bursa Malaysia, and IFAD. Next, please. So Global Environment Center is a Malaysian non-profit organization established 22 years ago. We've been working with Orang Asli communities in 5 states for the last 15 years. Next. Next. These are the 3 specific areas we work with the support of the microgrant facility in Southeast Pahang peatland landscape, Upper Kinta Basin in Perak, and Kuala Langat North Forest Reserve in Selangor. Next. These areas and landscapes are facing major challenges of degradation from drainage, fires, soil erosion, and damage to the water resources. Next. What indigenous practices have been successful? One of the key conclusions we have seen is that Orang Asli communities can play a very effective role in forest fire prevention and forest rehabilitation. We've seen this clearly in peat swamp forest systems, which are prone to fire, and action by the Orang Asli community has prevented fire, brought them under control, and started the rehabilitation of the forest system. Next. Orang Asli communities can also select and plant indigenous tree and bamboo to stabilize eroding slopes to protect water supply. And these are from the catchments above Ipoh City, where the action by the Orang Asli has helped reduce the erosion, which is affecting not only their water supply, but the water supply to Ipoh City. Next. So how are Orang Asli communities building back better post-COVID-19, or how can they build back better? One is the diversification of sustainable livelihoods based on natural resources. This is related to better stewardship of natural resources, such as protection of forests, fire prevention, establishment of community nurseries, and products which may be linked to natural resource, such as handicraft. Also, new products such as mushrooms, bamboo, and ecotourism can be introduced in this concept of the indigenous communities acting as the stewards of the land and then benefiting from related livelihoods. Forest nurseries with seedling buyback can be established to support land rehabilitation, and ecotourism and edutourism options are developed. Next. This is just one example of a forest nursery established by the local Orang Asli community near to Kuala Langat North Forest Reserve. But this nursery is also supplying plants and seedling also to rehabilitation projects, even in other states in Malacca and elsewhere in Selangor. Next. Also, the Orang Asli traditional knowledge and handicraft is a major potential source of income, provided that the natural plants which form the basis of the handicraft issues are maintained. And these are examples of handicraft centers developed with support from UNDP at Pulau Kempas in Kuala Langat. Next. These are ecotourism facilities for post-COVID visitors. So I think everyone been locked up for 18 months or coming to 2 years. And I think after the lockdown is lifted, we believe that there will be a significant increase or potential for Malaysian and others to visit areas in and around Orang Asli settlements for tourism and recreation. And therefore, in anticipation, support has been given to develop the facilities and trails in Upper Kinta Basin. Next. What support is needed to help build that better? I think first we have to look at promoting new norms for the prevention of COVID-19 infection in Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities. And that needs to be through appropriate education and provision of facilities and so on. Next. We need to build capacity and empower communities through training and peer-to-peer learning. I think that there is much that can be learned from one community to learn from other nearby communities. And this is the most effective way of long-term learning, of peer-to-peer learning. Next. We need to enhance the involvement of Orang Asli youth and children in natural resource conservation. We've had great success with our program of the community river rangers for monitoring river health, and also on the education programs with the Orang Asli community. Next, and this is just the final slide. Other support needed is networking between groups to share experience, training session with successful social enterprises, recognizing the rights and role of our Orang Asli community by state and local government, and recognition of the Orang Asli communities as key agents of change and management by JACOA, Forestry Department, and tourism authorities, developing marketing mechanisms and marketing chains to sell products, provide continuing care and motivation to the communities, and last but not least, enhancing resources to expand programs to support Orang Asli communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faisal. If you can pick up 2 points from your presentation. One is about building capacity. So the theory of change that I would like to propose is basically by having a good capacity at the Orang Asli communities, it will help reduce soil erosion, land erosion, which eventually helps in terms of maintaining water supply in Ipoh. I mean, for that case, for your case just now. And number two, which I see, the recognition to the Orang Asli communities as a stewards of the land needs to be organized accordingly. Thank you so much, Faisal. Let's move on to the next speaker. I would like to invite Pechin from Kuching to share her presentation. Over to you, Pechin.
Okay, thank you, Aspa. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pechin from Green Science and Technology Association Malaysia. We're based in Kuching, Sarawak. Next slide. So on bigger pictures, there are 26.7% of the livelihood worldwide are from the farming activities, while 80% of the world food produce actually come from the smallholder farmers community, which most of them are indigenous farmers. Our project focuses on Bidayu indigenous farmers in Padawan's area in Kuching, Sarawak. Next. The Bidayu communities has been able to adapt to the new norm during the lockdown by doing food processing instead of wasting the overflow of produce, and they have been implementing sustainability in farming, while we are ongoing assisting in channeling their pressed produce to the end consumer. Next slide, please. Throughout our execution, we have found out that the Bidayu community are actually aware of the environmental value, and we found out that these practices has been successful for them, and it is actually worth to sharing. For example, the agroforestry practices, where even though the Bidayu community are always using the slash and burn in farming, but they actually do leave some part of the land that act as the windbreaker to protect the crops. Also, to prevent the food waste of their produce due to the inability to sell during the outbreak, especially during the village lockdown, they practice the food preservative methods such as making the tempoyak from durian instead of letting it to be waste. So besides that one, they also practice some practices such as sustainable farming by using the used cloth as an alternative to the chemical in order to cover their crops to prevent and avoid the wild animal attack. And also some practices such as they are creative and smart in terms of they're using the ant colony, they migrate the ant colony to protect the crops against animals, even though they are not aware that the scientific method behind, which is called biological control agent. Next slide, please. To further enhance the indigenous practices, we think that there are some of the support that are needed. For example, an equal education and training for both men and women, as well as the youth, would be a good support. Not only that, the technical support for sustainable farming and agri food processing is an important support for them. They also need some marketing support, like the collaboration with the local governments, farmers, in order to market their fresh produce and shelf-stable product, especially during this pandemic time. So in case of the village lockdown, we also suggest on the immediate relief for their daily livelihood. Next slide, please. So for me, the Orang Asli building back battles means sustainability in terms of farmland, which is environments, communities, livelihood as social impact, as well as the stable income and fair trade for the economic impact for the indigenous community. So a great lesson learned for a post-COVID world would be the flexibility and to expose the potential in utilize the digital approach for the farmers. Next. Next slide, please. So here are some of the photos showing our on-ground work together with the Bidayu communities, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Patient. Thank you, Patient, for your presentation. A short one, but a loaded one, if I can see that. I noticed the education and also the marketing part has also been being stressed quite fully there. And I noticed also the marketing and education and marketing the key elements that has been also mentioned by the first and also second presenters. So I foresee those will be deliberated further during our Q&A session. We can discuss about it. And the other element which also being stressed time to time is about digitalization and how during this COVID-19, digital has actually helped the Orang Asli communities in terms of marketing their products and all that. Thanks, Patient. Let's move on to the last speaker of the session. I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia, Dr. Ismail Pralan, who will be able to really, from a slightly different perspective, from the government perspective, but how they have actually supported the work by Orang Asli in the context of access and benefit sharing. Dr. Ismail, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Asfar. Assalamualaikum and very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to present Forest Research Institute Malaysia FRIM, myself as DG of FRIM. For this, to answer this team station, we would like to share with all of you on the documentation of traditional knowledge, TK, related to medicinal plants used by indigenous people or Orang Asli in Peninsular Malaysia and implementation of access to benefit sharing. I noticed just now that there was a question on TK. We know that Orang Asli or these people, they have a lot of knowledge on TK, but in this case, we are focusing on the medicinal plant that used by these communities. Next slide, please. Now on the ABS, a little bit that was gazetted in 17 October 2017. There are 4 main components that covering on the authorities. We're talking about the federal authorities and competent authorities by the state government, mainly the EPU of state government. We have a requirement for permit to get access biological resources, monitoring and tracking, and number 4 on the clearing cost mechanism. Next, please. Maybe can I just briefly on the Orang Indigenous people in Indonesia. Based on the statistic by JAKOA, there was close to 180,000 Orang Asli in Peninsular Malaysia in 18 sub-ethnic category by Negrito, Senau, and Puerto Malays. Next, please. Now, this what I'm going to highlight to you, to all of you, on the FRAMES activities that related to TK of Orang Asli. Actually, since 2007, we are really actively conducted such project, and we have been funded more than 10 million ringgit Malaysia. In fact, one of the funder was UNDP Jeff. Thank you for that. And for this Malaysian plan of 12 plan, we have one project under our ministry amounted to 400,000. I just to inform the audience that more than 60 staff of FRAME, the officers and the staff involved in this project, covering a lot of aspects of expertise in FRAME. Next, please. This is among the photos that I want to share on the activities that we conducted, such as workshop, socio-economic survey, and others. Next, please. And good things that all the specimens that have been collected through these activities are stored in this our herbarium in print. So this for future reference by interested parties. Yeah. Okay, next. Based on the expertise of FRAME, we conducted this. The species that having all the potential medicinal values, we conducting bioactivities and phytochemical screening as shown in the slide. Next, please. As an outcome of the project, all sub-ethnic of Orang Asli in Indonesia, we have documented. In fact, some of them will replicate, because some of them not stay in the one place. There are a number of places that they are reside. And we have more than 1,000 respondents interviewed. All the species watcher and all databases, we use the existing one, BRAMS, also my TK digital library, this one by my IPO. And we have so far 10 books been published under this project. This is really institute competition and can be utilized for the reference by interested parties, as mentioned just now. And in terms of the program, we have a lot of workshop and also training courses conducted for the Orang Asli. Okay, next. So towards that, yet this is among the prototype that we are going to share, yet to be commercialized. But what I'm trying to say that there are potential of Orang Asli TK knowledge. We are trying to transfer it from the knowledge to the products in this project. Okay, next. When we talk about the commercialization, one of the main problems is the sustainable raw material. So we also conducting training, capacity building, also planting for Orang Asli. In fact, we also have it in our research center, research station of FRAME to plant those potential species. Okay, next please. I have 1 minute. Okay, and of course we have a lot of outreach program in fact, we also have discussion or consultation on the ABS agreement. Okay, next please. Okay, the benefits as I can share with all of you on the project, we can prevent the biopiracy and also implement the ABS Acts, and we have a lot of reference material to be utilized after this, the conservation of knowledge by the Orang Asli, development of the new herbal product, and also of course to demonstrate Malaysian commitment on the CBD and Nagoya Protocol. Next please. As a conclusion, sorry, with just 5 minutes time given to me, but I share to you that TK is very important. TK that belong to Orang Asli is very important, particularly on the economic, to conserve the heritage and also the preserve the biodiversity as well as the to prevent biodiversity, and also the intangible values attribute is on the capacity building to the Orang. I think the last few seconds left. Next, please. I just have to acknowledge my officers that involved heavily on this, Dr. Musada, Dr. Nani, and Mr. Parik, and the rest of who I said just now, 60 of them involved in this project. So actually, we have a strong team on the TK of Orang. Thank you very much. I'll give it back to Mr. Moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ismail. I think the key points of your presentation is the introduction of the EBS bill in 2017. That basically helps in terms of aligning the work on TK and how it will then benefit the communities. All right. We now move to the Q&A session. I would like to pick up one of the questions from the floor, very quickly from Azrina. So a question to Anne. So I think it's something that we have also discussing earlier, is that, yeah, true. Capacity building is vital. You know, we have been doing capacity building for a number of years already, and quite a number of programs being done by UN and also by the government on this. So the issue now here is how do we then ensure whether, the question is, were any of these good learnings since some of the projects have ended, especially for those trained in that project, paying it forward to the new generation that you are working now and otherwise? How should we sustain these learnings? So basically is how the training is done, how the training is then shared with the next generation or with other people. Basically how the OA communities who have attended the trainings or have built capacity become the trainers to others. And would you like to come in? But I would also like to invite others to also support, if any. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Asfa. We have been actually, before the OAMGF, we have been receiving the SGP and so many other programs, support, funding support from UNDP. And I think that is a privilege because it has helped a lot of communities. And mind you, a lot of those women who are involved in those projects has become Ketua Kampung, has become pengerusi JKK, because through the project, it has helped in their confidence building, and help their leadership. And the other thing that we have done, because we also want to ensure that we do not lose what we have learned, is we have established actually a network of communities. So we have this network of community learning centers, and also we have a network of community-based organization where we yearly we have what we call pertemuan pemimpin, and we also have a yearly meeting of youths. And also, I think through the community learning center, we also have the teachers. So we ensure this has helped us in ensuring that the learning is sustained. We continue to be in touch with all these members who have over the years have worked with us, and then continue to work with their children, and then now with their children. So their young people, the youths, are also now giving training and supporting the work in PACOS. So that's why the community-based work,
yeah. So the training by inheritance is also part of traditional knowledge, right?
Yes, exactly.
The process itself, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask Dr. Ismail, one point that was actually interesting, was actually quite interesting to know, is the issue on misappropriation and biopiracy. You know, how serious the issue is in Malaysia. And if I want to relate this back to Faisal's comment about the stewardship of the land, or stewardship of it's like an asset, you know, how do we then engage Orang Asli to help the government in terms of ensuring minimum misappropriation or minimum biopiracy happening in Malaysia? Dr. Ismail, then I would like to invite Faisal as well. Over. Yes.
Okay, we can just input on the question of the biopiracy. Actually, I have no info detail on that. That's why there were some cases. That's why we have government have this ABS. Basically, the funding that we got from UNDP partly actually to develop that ABS. Because not just in Malaysia, this ABS is also important throughout all the world. So we want to protect our resources, and now many of the resources also, or the knowledge by the local people, the Orang Asli people, that we have to preserve, not easily to be pirated by others. As you're aware, there were few cases maybe in Peninsular Malaysia, especially in Sarawak, but I don't think it's very serious. But then we have to be prepared on this. That's why government very seriously having this. As I mentioned in my presentation, they have databases, under BRAMS, also under my IPO that record all the the information related to the Orang Asli. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dr. Ismail.
Yeah.
Faisal, you would like to come in?
Yeah, certainly. I think that it's really a major missed opportunity or mechanism that we have not been making greater partnerships with the Orang Asal and Orang Asli to build on their traditional knowledge and their long-term stewardship of forest and land resources in the country. Very often they've been marginalized, they've been separated, and the government in its wisdom has almost cut them off from the forest resources and tried to replace it with plantations run by third parties or whatever. And then much of the traditional knowledge and the traditional livelihood and skills is lost in these communities. But we have seen really very strong and effective stewardship activity can take place provided that we empower and support them. And very key is getting the recognition from the forestry department and the state governments and others to recognize the Orang Asli community as the partners. In many of the landscape we worked in peatland areas, the Orang Asli were in the beginning just being blamed. Oh, the fires are all because the Orang Asli are doing this. The forest degradation is by Orang Asli. But we have shown when properly empowered and supported, the Orang Asli can transform the protection. They can be much better stewards of the land compared to the government agency because they're there all the time and they take much greater care of those areas. So I think this is very important for Malaysia to look at this as a real way forward and a green economy to build back better, empower and put your money to the communities to be land stewards.
Thanks, Faisal. I would like to also pick up one question from the floor. Maybe to Dr. Ismail, in case Frame has the knowledge on this. How do we I can only see S a bit here. How do we acknowledge and design the appropriate IP for inclusion to the benefit of the OA communities as continuous empowerment for their traditional environmental knowledge? I mean, do we have a process in Malaysia?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very important question. It's not short process, it's long processes involving a lot of parties. Through our experience in film, when we're doing this project, we are involving not just the federal government, as I mentioned just now, the federal government, but also the state government and the EQ, and all Orang Asli under Jakwa. I glad to mention that Orang Asli under the Jakwa, they have already created 25 cooperation within the Orang Asli. This is in the case of Peninsular Malaysia. Yeah, so long process. We have we have workshop, we have prior informed consent, PIC, series of that, not just one, series of that, and we have a social survey. And I would say I have information that I not really elaborate in my presentation because I just given 5 minutes. At least nine steps to be followed before we end up until the product, what they call the commercialization of a product. And we have also such an agreement how much the Orang Asli will get, or through their community will get the benefit economically, how much into a percentage to be given to the Orang Asli. So we do have that process. We put it also in our books. Those parties interested, you can just, as I said just now, we have 10 books for you to read. A lot of publication. We have 23 projects that related to Orang Asli alone, you just imagine. So we have a lot of information to be shared with others. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ismail. My last question, simple, patient. I really like your work in terms of small work done by the youth, and the spirit given by the Bidayuh community in supporting your work is very much appreciated. But that happens in the rural area, in kampong lah. But how do we foresee that those kind of initiatives to be replicated in the urban areas? You know, there are what it means is that there are some good practices that has been exercised by the Orang Asli that can be also be emulated in the urban areas. How do you think that can be done better? Over.
Thank you, Aspa, for the question. So from us as a youth, we think that actually some of the indigenous practices, like just now mentioned, is actually worth for sharing, especially for the urban citizens. So what we are actually working on is also like we are training the youth as well, the rural youth from the kampong, and they actually kind of like can assist us in terms of producing some of the educational material, like the short videos or some handbook presentation slide, in order to share to more, not only the ones in the urbans, but also like others country as well, because the educational material can be uploaded online. Yeah. So we hope to share on all this information. Yeah.
All right. Colleagues, thank you so much. I think we are reaching our end of our session here. A lot of things we discuss, but generally we talk about capacity building. Definitely is very important, and how they are able to cope during these resilient times, actually helping them during this difficult time. Education, of course, capacity building, education goes together. Marketing part, we have not really discussed about that, but I mean, most of you talk about marketing. How do we need a proper marketing strategy to help the Orang Asli, Orang Asal to promote their products. The use of digital technology, and last but not least, on sustaining the work that we are doing. So not just the communities themselves. So of course the communities will take care their own what needs to be done and all that, but support needed also for them to continue this. If there is some support from the government or any private sectors to come in and assist them along the way, and to replicate this as much as possible, that will be much appreciated. So that's it from me. I would like to hand this over to the speaker. To the main program, to Fariza. Nothing from us anymore. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
The All Lights Village project is an initiative that strives to tackle the issue of energy poverty in Orang Asli villages located in Pahang. Many underserved Orang Asli communities have no access to electricity and often resort to the use of non-renewable energy, such as burning palm fruits, using diesel lanterns or batteries. They spend a substantial proportion of their income purchasing fuels and batteries, yet these sources of energy are not bright enough. Non-renewable energy not only affects the village's productivity, but also has a negative effect on the environment. Without electricity, children also find it difficult to study at night. The Global Peace Foundation Malaysia strives to empower Orang Asli communities by taking a participatory approach. We conduct focus groups and discussions to develop solutions that fit the needs of the community. To address the issue of energy poverty, we provide an affordable solar lighting system that illuminates the homes of Orang Asli families at night. The solar lighting system also allows villagers to charge their mobile phones, which is a daily necessity to them. With solar lights, this has improved the villagers' productivity in the evening as well as reduced their energy expenditure.
Sebelum Sun King ni tak ada, saya memang susah sebab tak dapat saya nak buat apa-apa. Sekarang dah ada Sun King, saya rasa amat terima kasih lah. Saya pun rasa gembira sebab bila kita dah jam 7, jam 8 kita dah buka. Macam ada elektrik. Saya pun rasa sangat terima kasih lah.
We also facilitate and support Orang Asli village in building a rumah adat in their village. The rumah adat signifies the cultural identity of the Orang Asli and is an avenue for the community to strengthen cohesion. The rumah adat provides villagers with an established space to carry out community gatherings, training, village enterprise, and children learning programs. Additionally, we also provide Orang Asli villagers with hands-on training on farming, environmental conservation, and livelihood.
Gembira sangat sebab dapat makan sayur, cukup makanlah untuk anak-anak. Suami pergi kerja pun dah guna sayur tanaman sendiri. Bersyukurlah sangat.
We hope the training provides an opportunity for Orang Asli families to upscale and diversify their livelihood.
Thank you, panelists. What an illuminating discussion on how we can support our Orang Asli and Orang Asal communities, and especially by involving our youth here in Malaysia. Thank you to our attendees for your active participation in all of our polls today. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the final part of our webinar, and allow me to invite once again Ms. Mano Benia, Deputy Resident Representative, UNDP, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam to deliver her closing remarks. Please welcome Ms. Mano. Ms. Mano, sorry, you are muted.
Okay, good now. Thank you very much, Fariza. We are already at the end of this learning session, this 3-hour learning session, which passed like only 1 hour, in my opinion. This is actually the first time for UNDP to bring partners together to mark the International Day of the World Indigenous People. We took this opportunity to call upon colleagues, the government, academia, civil society, international partners to celebrate our Orang Asli, Orang Asal community's contribution to Malaysia's development, but also take the opportunity to discuss challenges and gaps, and how do we ensure a more inclusive development and build back better for Orang Asli communities. We have listened to several perspectives during this webinar. First, we learned on the global significance of the International Day of World Indigenous People, the importance of Indigenous people in helping the world achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the challenges they faced around the world, and the work that several stakeholders are doing nationally and internationally to address these challenges. Then we deep dive into the Malaysian context and highlighted some of the important challenges faced by Indigenous communities. Just to highlight a few takeaways from the discussion. We've talked about the impact of COVID and also now continuing the low rate of vaccination. And we saw that localizing the narrative and the information, including using local languages, has actually helped increase vaccination rate in communities. Other speakers raised also the issue of several speakers of limited internet access and its impact on both education and livelihood. Several NGOs are working to support capacity building in Indigenous communities. And there's also a need to continue promoting marketing mechanism, promoting products, online digital onboarding as well for communities to make sure that when a situation like COVID happens and there's lockdown, they can still continue generate their income and really become more digital. Some other speakers also raised the need to further look into the land issue. We looked at the importance of community forestry for Indigenous people. There were some good examples presented and how and where they can play a major role as well in conservation. Secondly, we heard stories of community-led action, stories of resilience, and stories of nature-based solutions. So I would like to thank all of those who share their experience, their project in local communities. These stories underscore, like our first speaker mentioned in her global perspective, that more than half of global GDP depends on nature, and that nature is the engine for at least half of the Sustainable Development Goals. So slowly we can see from the different speakers a change in narrative. We are seeing new narrative that views indigenous people not only as vulnerable to climate change impact, but also leaders in climate resilience and practice. We are also seeing emerging narrative that goes beyond indigenous people being underserved recipients of formal economy, but that they can also be agent of change and redefining the very different model underpinning our economic system. But support and innovation partnership were needed and highlighted strongly by several of the speakers. We need to work together in the identification of needs and issues and jointly finding solutions both for short and longer term development challenges and agenda. But this includes involving community themselves and finding ways to be more empowering and participatory. I think today's event showed the importance of supporting and working indigenous communities in the post-pandemic recovery, including to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and other development challenges. Several examples were shared today, and I hope you were like me, you got inspired by some of the ongoing initiatives and some of the proposed solutions by the speakers. With today's webinar, UNDP wanted to create a platform, a first dialogue among NGO governments, and to come together to address Orang Asli vulnerable communities for the Sustainable Development Goals. And I would like to really thank all the speakers and panelists for sharing their knowledge and their experience with us today. We hope that this is only the beginning and that we will continue working together in exchanging experiences and opportunities and help inform future policy discussion to build back better and make sure Orang Asli and Orang Assal communities are not left behind. UNDP will continue to support national partners to achieve the objective of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People adopted in 2007 and the achievements of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As mentioned by EPU in his opening speech, we look forward to supporting the development of the Orang Asli policy during the 12th Malaysia Plan. So once again, thank you very much for all of you who attended the webinar, all our speakers. I hope you leave this session as inspired as I am, and I look forward to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, wraps up today's proceedings. Thank you, Ms. Manon, for the powerful message. Indeed, we are all as inspired as you, if not more. And thank you, attendees, for joining us all through the webinar. It has been an absolute pleasure seeing you all today. One final request, attendees, we would appreciate if you could answer the survey question by scanning the QR code on the screen or by clicking on the link that is provided in the chat box. We would love to hear your feedback, comments, and suggestions. We sincerely hope that the panel discussions and Orang Asli, Orang Assal knowledge showcases will bring more insightful conversations. Take care and stay safe. Please keep yourself updated through UNDP Malaysia and their respective Orang Asli and Orang Assal grantees, social media, and website. We look forward to seeing you in the upcoming UNDP webinar series. And until then, I'm Fariza Alia, signing off on behalf of the United Nations Development Programme.